Welcome to Global Justice Report, a new online production of the Center for Global Justice. I'm Cliff Durand, your host today. Glad to have you with us. I know some people have had trouble getting in, but hopefully everyone who wants to has been able to access this program by now, either on Zoom or through YouTube. The Center for Global Justice is a multinational and bilingual research center in San Miguel de Allende. The center is devoted to research and learning for a better world. Since 2004, we've offered educational programs in English for expats and visitors, and programs in Spanish for the Mexican community. We've also organized educational travel to Cuba and to Chiapas. Our vision is to move control of economic life and relations with Mother Earth from the 1% to the 99%. Coronavirus has set in relief the failures of neoliberal capitalism. Our weekly Global Justice Report will explore various grassroots democratic solutions, including self-management, cooperatives, mutual aid, public banking, and much, much more. At the end of the program, I'll give you some information about upcoming events, but that schedule is listed on our website at globaljusticecenter.org. We are always eager to have suggestions for future webinars. You can send your suggestions to this email address, global.justice.cliff@gmail.com. That is the email address you will also use if you have questions or comments for our speakers. We're fortunate today to have two outstanding speakers who will discuss the new Nafta 2.0, it's called. President Trump proclaims that the trade deal between the US, Mexico, and Canada is a great improvement over Nafta. But is USMCA, as it's officially called, really different? Or is it Nafta 2.0? Is it an improvement for working people on both sides of the border? To assess the improvements and limitations, we bring you two experienced observers, one from the US, the other from Mexico. Robert Scott will look at the economic impact of the revised NAFTA on US workers. Malin Jönsson will look at the impact in Mexico, particularly on campesinos. Robert Scott is an economist at the Economic Policy Institute. He is EPI's Director of Trade and Manufacturing Policy Research. He's published widely in academic journals and often appears in the media. Malin Jönsson, am I pronouncing your name right? I know you're Swedish by birth.
Malin Jönsson.
Jönsson. Since I grew up in a area of the United States with lots of Swedish population, I should be able to do better on that.
It's okay.
But in any case, she is professor in rural problems and human rights at the National School of Social Work at UNAM, the National University of Mexico, National Autonomous University. She's also coordinator of Semillas de Vida Foundation, Seeds for Life, a civil association that works with the conservation, protection, and development of native maize seeds in peasant hands and for a healthy diet, from seed to table. The original NAFTA, in effect for over 2 decades, has drastically moved Mexico away from a national economic development strategy to an increasing dependency on the United States and on transnational corporations. And Robert will tell us more about that, I'm sure. Neoliberal policies removed government support for small-scale campesino agriculture, forcing millions off the land to migrate to the cities and to El Norte. Privatized land has been taken over by industrial agriculture producing for export, while Mexico's people are increasingly fed by imported foods. At the same time, industrial production has increasingly fallen into the hands of transnational corporations, producing for the US and global markets. The impact of NAFTA has also been devastating in the US, as manufacturing jobs were moved to the Mexico as US corporations took advantage of compliant low-wage labor and lax regulations. This became the template for trade agreements across the globe, undercutting the American dream for millions of workers. That ended up providing a popular base of disillusioned workers for Donald Trump. Will the new NAFTA President Trump fashioned change any of this? Well, that's the question our panel will examine today. Our first speaker will be Robert Scott. Welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Cliff. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today and to speak with your audience. I'll start with a word about my institute. It's a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank based in Washington, D.C., where we are focused on doing research on economics and economic policy and the way in which it affects working people, primarily in the United States, but we're also, of course, interested in how that interacts with workers in other countries. This was founded about 30 to 35 years ago in part by a group of labor unions and other progressives. The first president was Jeff Foe, who many of you know. He sometimes visits in San Miguel, and I know he's spoken for many years at the Institute there. And we're thrilled that he's still able to work with us at EPI. And he's a good friend, and I appreciate the invitation to be here with you today. I'm going to start at what I like to call the 30,000 foot level, and sort of provide a little more background on how NAFTA has affected workers in the US, but really throughout the hemisphere, and set it in a bit more of a global context, and then turn to talking about the so-called NAFTA 2 or USMCA agreement, as we call it here in the United States, US-Mexico-Canada agreement. That's the formal name we gave it here. And so to start with NAFTA, NAFTA was an agreement conceived by the first Bush administration, the late 1980s, to bring together the U.S., Mexico, and Canada in a single North American production and trading system. It was an agreement that, as Jeff has described in his book, A Global Class War, as he said, it was an agreement that created a North American constitution for international businesses. It was an agreement to provide a deregulated environment for those businesses, and it really encouraged them to invest internationally to come up with a system that really chased the lowest wages and the weakest regulatory standards, and to drive down standards throughout the hemisphere. So the consequence was that there was a substantial increase in multinational investment in Mexico. Foreign investment in Mexico roughly tripled between the decade before NAFTA, which took effect in, I think, January 1st of 1993. So for the decade before that, comparing the following 2 decades, foreign investment in Mexico tripled. And that fueled a tremendous outsourcing of factories from the US to Mexico, especially in the automotive sector. That's been the sector where trade has expanded most rapidly, but also in electronics and in food trade and energy trade as well, as you alluded to earlier, Cliff. This did not deliver benefits to workers in Mexico, as we know. I've been involved in a series of studies. I've been examining NAFTA for most of my career, beginning in the 1990s when I first did a study of the economic effects of NAFTA on employment in the US. I've done a number of those in the last 2 decades, looking both at NAFTA and the US trade with China and other countries. I did a couple of 3-country studies for the NAFTA region. Most recently, we did a study on NAFTA at 10 with Carlos Salas from Mexico, writing a chapter on Mexico, and Bruce Campbell writing a chapter on Canada, and I wrote the chapter in the US, and Jeff Foe wrote the overview for that study. And what we found is that even after the first 10 years, NAFTA had been a disaster for workers in all 3 countries. NAFTA was supposed to create a middle class in Mexico and deliver rising wages through the jobs that were allegedly going to be created. But in fact, as we know, the jobs have not helped Mexico. In fact, in Mexico, there has been a change in the structure of production. Mexico has developed much more export production oriented towards the US. On the other hand, the agreement forced Mexico to basically dissemble its developmental state and the protections it provided for native domestic production in the manufacturing sector. So many of the jobs gained in export production were offset by jobs lost in production for the domestic market. So there are very few net gains for workers in Mexico. And studies have shown there's been essentially no change in inequality in Mexico over the last 2.5 decades since NAFTA took effect. In the United States, I've done studies most recently in 2013, a study called Heading South, which showed that we'd lost about 700,000 jobs to Mexico, largely because of growing trade deficits with Mexico. Now, how does that work? In theory, increases in exports to Mexico support domestic employment, but increases in imports tend to cost jobs. They displace jobs that could have been made producing goods here at home in the United States. And so we had basically balanced trade. We had a small surplus with Mexico in 1993 before the agreement took effect. And since then, we developed a large trade deficit with Mexico. And as a result, we have displaced through 2010 about, as I said, nearly 700,000 jobs. Now, since 2010, the U.S. deficit with Mexico has grown significantly, by more than 50%. And in fact, most of that increase occurred between 2018 and 2019. The reason for that had to do in part with a different aspect of the Trump trade policies. I think it had largely to do with Trump's tariffs on China. So all of these agreements and trade flows are connected. Trump imposed large tariffs on China beginning in 2018. And as a result, China's exports to the rest of the world increased. Its trade with the world increased overall, but its trade with the US was reduced. And I think what happened was simply that China's exports to the US were redirected through other countries in Southeast Asia, as well as in Mexico. So that's my hypothesis. I haven't tested it yet, but I think that's what happened. Let me return to the scene of the crime and go back to the NAFTA story, and then bring us up to date and talk about what happened in the USMCA agreement and how it's likely to affect workers here in the United States and throughout the hemisphere. As I said, the main effect of the NAFTA agreement was to transfer factories and jobs from the US to Mexico. This was part of a larger process of globalization that we've gone through over the last 2.5 decades. The US has lost 91,000 factories between 1997 and 2018, and nearly 5 million manufacturing jobs. That's about 1/3 of our manufacturing industries. And this has devastated manufacturing workers in particular, who produce most of the traded goods. And it's put tremendous downward pressure on the wages of manufacturing workers. Well, who are the manufacturing workers? Largely, those are non-college educated workers. Manufacturing employs more non-college educated workers than other sectors of the economy. And of course, those workers are mostly in the bottom 70% or so of the wage structure. So it's mostly working class people. And so their wages have been decimated by NAFTA and other trade agreements, like the agreement to bring China into the World Trade Organization, which took effect in 2001. So NAFTA depressed wages, both by destroying those good jobs, but also by putting workers in the US into competition with workers in other low wage countries like Mexico and China and elsewhere in the world. And my colleague Josh Bivens has estimated that the net effect of growing trade with low wage countries has depressed wages of the median working class worker by about $2,000 per year. That's a bigger effect than any other single government policy that we can identify. It is larger than the tax bill, the total tax bill, including Social Security payments for most working families. So it's been a large and significant negative impact on workers, and that's actually what I like to refer to as the hidden part of the iceberg. The visible part of the iceberg is a job loss, and we see that throughout the industrial areas of the U.S. Cities like Detroit and Youngstown, Ohio, and the steel towns, Pittsburgh, have been devastated by the loss of factories and the jobs that are associated with them. But beyond that, the hidden part of the iceberg is the downward pressure on wages, and that helps explain the growing gap between the haves and the have-nots, between working class voters and those in the top 10, 1 and 0.1% of the economy. And other EPI research has shown that over the last 30 years, that most of the benefits of growth have gone to those in the top 1%, as Cliff was suggesting, and very little benefits have gone, a very small share of the benefits have gone to workers in the bottom 90%, and especially to working class workers in the bottom 3/4 of the labor force. Their wages have gone up by at most 15% over the last 3 or 4 decades, while those at the top have seen their incomes double and treble over the same period. Globalization is a big part of that story. And the reason I tell this story is to illustrate the point that NAFTA was really a critical part of that process. It set the template. It created the constitution that was used to negotiate dozens of trade agreements around the world. And these were really more than trade, they're trade and investment agreements. They establish rules for investment that encourage the growth in outsourcing and so-called global supply chains. It's resulted in, as I said, trade deals with China, Korea, and other countries that have created the whole process of globalization. Clearly, these changes have had enormous effects on workers in the United States as well as Mexico. Here in the United States, where I said, I think globalization, I think led to a rise in nationalization. And I'm sorry, I misspoke. Let me say that again. Led to a rise in nationalism, which I think played a critical role in the election of Donald Trump in 2016. Maybe we can get into that in the Q&A, but I want to focus with my remaining remarks on the USMCA agreement, or Nafta 2, talk about what it did and did not do, and then we can maybe turn to some of these larger issues in discussion. Now, Donald Trump was campaigned on and was elected on a campaign which was heavily critical of globalization, of the NAFTA agreement, the agreement to bring China into the WTO. And he claimed that he was going to help workers by tearing these agreements up and renegotiating them. What did he do, in fact? Well, we had a multi-year process of renegotiating NAFTA under the point of a gun. Trump threatened to tear up the NAFTA agreement and to terminate all of its provisions if Mexico and Canada did not agree to go along with what he wanted in the New Deal. He got many changes, but it turns out that when you look beneath the hood, the changes were not particularly significant as far as the fundamental trade and investment relationships are concerned. The U.S. International Trade Commission did a study of the expected impacts of the USMCA on the U.S. economy, and they projected that it would increase U.S. GDP by about 0.25% over a period of 6 years. Now, how much is that? As economist Dean Baker has said, it is about equal to the amount by which the economy grows over 6 weeks. So over 6 years, the economy might grow slightly faster, if you believe the numbers. They claim that there would be some 250,000 jobs created, but the vast majority of those would be in services sectors. And I want to talk a little bit about what's driving those assumptions, and then illustrate some of the problems with them. Some of the significant changes in the NAFTA agreement, many of them were focused on the auto sector. As I said earlier, automotive trade is one of the most important in NAFTA, and there have been complaints from workers that wages were too low in Mexico, and that it was used as a vehicle to import products from other countries and get around so-called rules of origin. Rules of origin specify that in order to qualify for special NAFTA tariffs, a certain share of products have to be assembled, made and assembled here in North America. So the rules of origin were tightened up and raised from about, on average, about 65% up to 75 or 85%, I forget the exact figure. And they also created a new so-called labor value-added requirement that requires up to 40 or 45% of products made in North America to be made with labor that is earning $16 an hour or more. So these two new requirements, higher rules of origin, higher labor standards, the or wage standards, as I'll refer to them. And so the question was whether or not that would shift production of autos to North America, to the U.S. and to Canada. The International Trade Commission claimed that these provisions would create about 28,000 jobs in the United States. They'd increase investment by a little bit less than $700 million a year. But these are highly controversial estimates. A group of economists at the International Monetary Fund looked at them, these same provisions, and they claimed that the agreement would in fact reduce auto production in the United States. It might increase it slightly in Canada, perhaps slightly in Mexico. The problem with analysis of the auto provisions is this. Tariffs on autos entering the United States are quite low. They're about 5%. So if these rules make production in North America too costly, it will be easier for auto companies simply to offshore production of the entire auto value chain outside of North America, to move production to Korea or China or to Southeast Asia. And in fact, this is what we see happening already. GM closed the Youngstown plant this year, the auto assembly plant, and 2 others. Ford has announced they're going to terminate all car production in the United States in the next few years. So already we see that the USMCA is not having the intended effects on the auto industry. As I said, this suggests that the IMF had it more correct than the International Trade Commission. There's another study from the Peterson Institute of International Economics that also projected that the NAFTA provisions would have a negative effect on auto production. So this is one of the controversial areas of the agreement. There are others that I want to talk about briefly. Most of the benefits that the International Trade Commission expected to occur were in the intellectual property area. They claimed that this would increase the certainty of investment, leading to an overall rise in investment in services. That's why we saw the services jobs gains. Those are most of the jobs that they projected would be gained under the agreement, about 150,000 in total. And these were jobs in the investments in areas like trade, intellectual property products, copyrights, patents, and so on. And this raises another controversial provision of the agreement. One of the things the agreement did was to require Mexico and Canada to provide 10 years of protection to so-called biologics. There's a category of drugs that are custom designed to meet the particular genetic profile of individual patients. These are the hot new commodity in the pharmaceutical industry. And although they're not particularly relevant, as I understand it, to the COVID crisis, I think they're going to be relevant increasingly to healthcare and for many other kinds of problems going forward. Well, the problem is this is going to raise the cost of drugs enormously, and it's going to cost lives. So profits may go up, production may go up, but it's going to be very costly, especially for low-income consumers in Mexico. So those are just a couple of the main provisions of the USMCA agreement overall. It's going to have at most a small impact on the U.S. economy. I'm sorry, there's one more aspect I do want to talk about. I know I'm running over on my time, but let me just conclude with this following point. The other critical issue, which I do want to mention, is the impact on wages, because this was one of the main provisions which workers, I think in all 3 countries, were interested in. The labor standards in the original NAFTA agreement were very weak, there were no enforcement provisions that were completely ineffective. There were higher labor standards in the USMCA agreement. Mexico was forced to expand protection of labor rights, at least in name. And perhaps we'll hear more about that from Malin a little bit later. But this has been a big issue for workers in the US and Mexico. As you know, labor rights enforcement is extremely weak in Mexico. Workers in the US have claimed that weak labor rights enforcement is one reason that NAFTA has been such a drain on wages in the US. This is a big issue for workers here. The International Trade Commission estimated that the labor rights provisions in the NAFTA agreement were going to result in a 17% increase in wages in Mexico in the first 6 years rather, and that this would result in an increase in wages in the United States. Unfortunately, when you dig beneath the hood, even the ITC zone models, these estimates don't tend to stand up. I've got a couple of papers about these issues on the website where we looked in detail at the ITC's forecasts. The ITC did what's called a sensitivity analysis. They have a model and they asked what happens if they assumed a greater growth in wages in Mexico rather than going up 17%, if they went up 37%. And their studies showed that this had no effect whatsoever on wages in the United States. So the connections between the two markets, at least in the ITC models, are pretty weak. And again, this illustrates a problem with the model and with the agreement overall. This agreement is not going to deliver significant benefits, in my estimation, for workers in Mexico or the United States or Canada. It is going to continue the pattern of the NAFTA agreement. It's going to continue to channel benefits to investors. Even the ITC study suggests that most of the benefits will go to investors, in this case, in high-tech industries. So it seems like, despite all of the claims of the Trump administration about being an advocate for workers, for fixing the NAFTA agreement, most of the fixes tend to benefit the 1%, not the 99. So with that, I'll stop and turn it back to you, Cliff, and to Malin, and look forward to the discussion.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Robert. Yes, now we want to turn the floor over to Malin Jönsson, who will be focusing on the impact in Mexico, particularly on agriculture. So take it away.
Yes, thank you very much for the invitation. And I think it's quite interesting because I have a very, very different perspective than Robert. So I think we could be an interesting discussion. I think that in the case of the agriculture production, at least seen from the Mexican small-scale farmers, there was no one that thought there was going to be a better situation with the new NAFTA agreement. And I don't think it's going to be, I think I agree a lot with Robert, what he was saying, of course, that it's a continuation of NAFTA. It's like, it's the same basis. And I'm going to share my screen. It's the same basis, and it's just like making a bit, making it stronger within some of the things that sort of seen from the transnational corporations' point of view was missing in the first NAFTA agreement. Because, okay, so I'm going to talk about the Mexican campesinos. When I say campesinos, I mean small-scale farmers, family farmers. And I use this concept because it's political, and it's so much more than just family farmers or peasants, because peasants also have a little bit of negative connotation. My perspective is mostly from this perspective, because my perspective is mostly taking part from the small-scale farmers' perspective, because I work in an organization that works with small-scale farmers, and that's why it's going to be quite different. You can see here on the first screen, you can see my screen, right? Yeah, Yes, okay, very good. You can see in here some lovely maize from Veracruz, from the south of Mexico. And this is one of the main problems. Right, as you can see. There you go. So this is what I'm going to talk about. First, the maize biodiversity in the hands of the campesinos, because from our perspective, this is one of the main threats with the NAFTA. The NAFTA, I think it's easier to say NAFTA. Nafta 2. In Mexico, we call it TEMEC. It's on, but USMCA, well, we're getting used to it, right? So Nafta 2, we can say. I think it's seen from the Mexican agricultural production, one of the most threatened sectors is the biodiversity. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, because it's sort of, you have to show why it's such a big threat. And of course, neoliberal free trade model that we have heard about up until now in more general perspective, we're gonna mention it. And agricultural product trade, how it's been developing, consequences affecting the campesinos. And biotechnology, contradictions, upphov, convention. These two aspects I will talk about them because it's like the ones that are new, seen from the agriculture perspective, and also like seen from the Mexican perspective. Okay, so here you can see a lovely milpa from Estado de Mexico, and this is the way traditionally you grow maize in a big part of Mexico. You grow it together with zucchini, with beans as a base, like in I think in English you call it Three Sisters, but you also have a lot of green herbs and a lot of also other legumes that you can use, because it's sort of creating an own ecosystem. So the beans are fixing the nitrogen and giving it to the maize. So this is like the opposite of the huge monoculture production that we can see, well, a little bit in the north of Mexico, but mainly in the United States. Yes, and we're here in the center of a region of maize. I'm taking the the perspective of maize because it's one of the most important grains in Mexico, but also in the world. It's actually the most produced grain in the world. And here we are the center of a region, domestication and diversification. That means that it is here, that is okay, I sorry, it's a long time ago I spoke English, but you took the salvage. Well, it was here that you sort of campesinos invented the maize for about 9,000 to 7,000 years ago. And we have here in Mexico, we call it races, but I'm not sure it works in English. So we more than 64 subspecies and thousands of varieties, like all the maize, all the farmers that have a native maize production or landrace maize production, they actually almost, you can say, that have their own subspecies, but their own variety. Because if you choose your seeds and you save the seeds for the next harvest, so you are changing the seeds according to what you would like or what you like to eat, or they changing the climate, for example. And this is also why it's so important with this diversity, because in these seeds that are in the hands of the farmers, every plant is special. It's unique. It's like a person, like a unique person. Every person is unique, and it's like the opposite as well to the seeds that are patented by the corporations. And these patents which are protected in the free trade agreements. Well, so this has been going on for the last 9,000 to 10,000 years. Actually, the oldest maize that was found here in Mexico is in Guerrero. It's 9,700 years old. So it's like about 330 generations that have been selecting the seeds. So this genetic diversification is also very important, for example, climate change, because, when a species of plants develop, there's sometimes mutations, or there are always mutations, and some mutations could be more resistant against a drought or a cold climate, and they would survive better. So the plants, when you select the seed and you sow them the next year, then you can develop the seeds in the context, in the climate context. we have also, it's very important to emphasize here in Mexico, we have more than 700 different dishes prepared with maize, well, registered. They're all quite, when you explain them, some of them are quite similar, but it's like a sign of how huge and how vast the food culture from the maize is here. Why maize has been so popular around the world is one of its adaptability, because you can grow the maize on sea level up until 3,000 meters above sea level. This is also one of the things that have sort of helped the small scale farmers to keep on with their maize production, because there's not so much hybrids or so-called improved seeds or genetically modified seeds that actually works in 3,000 meters above sea level. So as I said before, right now the maize, the corn is the main agricultural crop in the world. It's produced like 30% more than rice and 30% more than wheat as well. So a little bit about the neoliberal free trade model. I really love to like put some photos here, because if you haven't been to Mexico or you haven't been to Mesoamerica, which is a part of the Central region, or in South America, you also have some lovely different colors of seeds. You might not know that maize has so many different colors. Well, the neoliberal free trade model, now we heard a little bit about it, or a lot about it from Robert, and as he said, it's based upon foreign investment and trade. For the agriculture, it's very important that when Nafta was implemented in '94, there was total trade liberalization for the agriculture product. Well, almost totally, but in the case of maize, it was gradual actually, because maize, beans, and also sugar is some of the most important products in Mexico. So it was gradual up until 2008, and then was totally liberalized. And that means that all the imported maize in Mexico is sort of competing with the maize. The imported corn is competing with the diverse maize in Mexico, and the prices are more or less the same. Well, it depends a lot, because Mexico is a very, very, very diverse country. And if you are in the mountains in Guerrero or Veracruz, you have very different access to the markets than you have in Sinaloa, for example, in the north of Mexico. But the price is deregulated, so the price is set by the market. So that's why it's so important in this context to see that all the maize that we import, it actually lowers the prices here in Mexico. We have some studies that's showing that you have a dumping prices, and that means that the prices paid to the farmers are even below the cost production prices. And that's very true, because last year, for example, the price wasn't even was about the average price paid per kilo for the maize here in Mexico was 4 pesos, which is like 20 cents a kilo, and that is not enough to survive on, and it's not covering even the costs. So this really are these free trade agreements. Right now, Nafta 2.0. Nafta 2 is not called free trade agreement, but when you enter to and you look at it, and when you look at the explanation of the trade agreement, is still a free trade agreement. But I assume that they took it away from the name, because free trades in some circles have a bit of negative connotation, so they want to just call it an agreement. But it's really an agreement, like Robert said, that it's protecting the rights of the corporations before the people's and environmental rights. We can see one example of this is that the corporations can sue the nation states for profits lost, future profits lost. So it's like, so for example, if I'm a corporation that want to open a mine, for example, and Mexico says, no, you can't open a mine here because you will violate the rights of the indigenous people or some environmental rights, then I can actually sue Mexico for my loss in the future. So they have a sort of you have this suing that's also why it's a supranational agreement. It's above the national level. Here I put a quote from Nafta 2, new agreement to support mutually beneficial trade leading to freer, fair markets and to robust economic growth in the region. And this is, okay, freer, fair markets. It's not so clear why it would be fairer, but that's probably the argument that we need to use to approve it. So we're going to look a little bit on the agriculture production trade. And here we can see the difference between the corn produced in a global scale and the corn produced, well, we also produce yellow corn here, but actually the corn that it's important, it's almost all yellow. And in Mexico, we actually eat more the white maize than the yellow. 1/3 of the maize consumption is imported. 1/3 about, last year was 32%. And it's this genetically, mostly yellow genetically modified maize, because about 93% of all the corn produced in the United States is genetically modified. And here in Mexico, it's actually still illegal to cultivate genetically modified maize, thanks to a class action, which my organization is a part of this class action, because of all the risks that it implies. It actually, we're going to see some of the risks further ahead. But this is also corn produced on a big scale in monocultures and a very intensive way, where a lot of agrochemicals, a lot of when you see agrochemicals like the glyphosate, that it's by the International Health Organization is deemed probably you can get cancer from it. So it's a very different type of production than the milpa, for example. Okay, in Mexico we also have this a little bit more intensive scale as well in the north of the country. So it's very diverse. But this is important because we are showing here which type of production is competing with our production, maize production in Mexico. We also import 80% of rice and wheat. So in the context of the Nafta agreement, what has happened in Mexico is that we have a food dependency. We're not only dependent on the United States with the economic aspects, but we have a very big food dependency, mainly with the staple grains, because that's what United States produce a lot and have overproduction. So what they want to export. But on the other hand, just as also Robert mentioned, we are now in Mexico the main exporter of avocado, tomato, lime, zucchini, chile in the world, And this is all in the context of the Nafta agreement, because our biggest market is the United States. This dependency, as we see with the presentation of Robert as well, it's like, it's mutual in the sense that we are importing the staple foods, which are actually putting our population in a very vulnerable position when the staple food prices increments, as they did in 2008 to 2014. But we also like exporting a lot of these fruits and vegetables, and that's actually similar to the industry, right? Because they're fruit and vegetables that require a lot of man labor force. So we have an overexploited workforce and environment. In this way, it's similar to the industry, because we are competing with the tomato production in the United States. For example, in the case of the sugar, a lot of sugarcane producers in the United States have protested of the export of the sugar from Mexico, because it's quite interesting. Because in Mexico, we produce a lot of sugar canes, and like historically, there had been a big state support for the sugar cane production, and so we are exporting about 16% of the sugar canes that we produce in Mexico, but we're importing jaraba de alta fructosa, I'm not sure what syrup and high fructose
corn syrup.
Exactly, that's what we're importing. So that's what we're importing to use for the soda industry, because we're also like the biggest consumers of soda and Coca-Cola and all this stuff in the world. So it's very contradictory there as well. So we have overexploited workforce and environment, because these are also cultivated with a lot of chemicals and sort of stuff, and also like a special climate. The avocado needs a very special climate to be produced, and it can't be produced in a lot of places in the world. But yeah, so that's the agriculture. So these are things that's just gonna keep on growing with the Nafta 2 agreement. It's not gonna change so much. We have some consequences affecting the campesinos from the biodiversity perspective. Well, as I mentioned, we have very low prices paid to the campesinos. Yeah, for the maize mainly, but also the rice and the wheat, because it have really dumped the prices with this Nafta agreement. And it's promoting a very destructive agricultural production, this agro-industrial production that I mentioned, which is very high intensive, and it's very destructive for the soils, for the environment in general. And this is what I wanted to emphasize as well. We have a problem with the transgene GMO contamination of our maize, because the first time they found transgene in a Mexican maize was in Oaxaca in 2001. And this is a gene that's a property of a corporation. So this is, in the long run, it's very, actually these transgenes, they sort of amplified. It could be more than one transgene in one crop. So it's a very huge threat against the biodiversity. But it's also like, now if we're going to privatize the seeds in Mexico, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, it's also a very high risk that the corporations can say, this is my seed, this is my maize, because the gene, I can find my gene in your maize, even though the farmer hasn't even used their crop. So this is the threat against the maize agrobiodiversity, and also a threat against the food culture, our history, traditions, and identity, because the maize, the maize biodiversity is such a big part of all of these aspects. And as I told you, the maize evolution, and not only the maize, but the evolution of the plants, is necessary from our perspective to do it actually with the farmers in the places where the farmers grow the stuff. And it's not possible to keep on doing it in laboratory only. All the crops that are developed by corporations have in some way, it's the basis is the crops that the campesinos have developed during these thousands of years. And if we don't give the chance or and support the campesinos to keep on and protect the seeds in their hands and to keep on this development, we will have a problem in the future for food. And yeah, so we have some biotechnology contradictions seen from a Mexico point of view, because as I told you, also our president López Obrador has said there will be no GMO maize in Mexico. So that's he has said that, but then he hasn't really shown it in actions. We have this class action against the genetically modified production of maize in Mexico, now 7 years. It's not finished. We're still going strong in that one. But in this agreement, okay, so biotechnology and genetically modified organisms is basically the same thing in our definition. In the agreement in Nafta 2 and also in Nafta, it's not called genetically modified seeds, it's not called transgenes. It's also like it's here shown how the concepts really changes, and when you give a negative connotation of a concept, you can't reuse it. So in the Nafta agreement, it said the parties confirm that the importance of encouraging agricultural innovation and facilitating trade in products of agriculture biotechnology. So this is actually going totally against what López Obrador is saying, as we actually now, when we have Nafta 2 agreement, we are obligated to encourage the authorization of agriculture biotechnology. And this could be a problem because it could be used as an argument to blocking the trade and the investment, right? So this is also something that we've been starting to see now, because we have withdrawn some permits to import the genetically modified cotton, for example. And we have in the government and in the Secretary of Environment, for example, we have a lot of resistance against genetically modified. So there have been talks about that United States wants to use this tool of the panels to start to say that Mexico is actually going against the agreement. So this is sort of putting us in a worse position than it was before. Let's see how, I'm not sure how my time is also, so my time is running out, so I'm gonna just mention this as well. In this in NAFTA 2, we are obligated to approve UPOV, International Union of Protection of New Varieties and Plants. That means here in Mexico, you can't patent seeds for the moment. So by ratifying this agreement, or this convention, is more a convention than an agreement, we are actually going to have to implement the breeders I'm putting in the quotation marks, because actually I would see that the campesinos are the breeders as well, but protecting the breeders' rights, that means in practice the rights of the corporations, which is the core of the agreement, right? Just like Robert said. So this is trading the intellectual property, the rights of the intellectual property for the corporations, and it's putting in risk a seed appropriation, because we can see in the world market of seed production, we have Monsanto that was bought by Bayer, which is a big, huge corporation, transnational corporation. I think a lot of you know it, of course. And they actually control about 33% of the whole world seed market. So it puts our seeds in that risk. Now there have been an initiative to reform the federal law of vegetable varieties, which was the first step towards seed privatization in Mexico. It was created in '96, but now they want to reform it to implement things like destroying crops and fining farmers who save and exchange seeds. So this is something very serious, because when you start to criminalize the farmers in what they have been doing for thousands of years, and which we should thank them and actually protect their rights to keep on growing and exchanging the seeds, because it's the basis of the evolution of the seeds. Instead, you are giving the rights to the corporations that have actually taken the seeds and just changed them a little bit and saying, this is my seed now. So this is a very big threat against the future of biodiversity. We would say that if you don't protect the seeds in the hands of campesinos, we will lose the struggle for maize. So I think it's very, very important that at least now we signed it. It's now happening NAFTA 2, and we also have the Trans-Pacific Partnership, where we also have agreed to, Mexico have agreed to ratify UPOV 91, as it's called. So we have to, in one or another way, implement some laws that will support it. But we have to. It's central that we make all the laws that really are protecting the rights of the campesinos, which is also something we should do according to the Declaration of the Rights of the Farmers of the UN. Well, I will leave it there, and if you have questions, you saw that this is a very, very different presentation. I'm really sorry about my English. It's not so well trained, but if you have questions, you can find us on the internet, and also we will be here having the questions and answers. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you very much, Malin. That was very instructive, and I'm sure that there are those who have questions. So let me remind you, you should email your questions to this address, global.justice.cliff@gmail.com. and I will relay your questions or comments to our speakers. While we're waiting for the first questions to come in, let me just raise a question that a topic that was only briefly alluded to in the presentations, and that is the change in the investor-state dispute settlement mechanism, ISDS. One of the features of NAFTA was that corporations had the right to sue states and sue them not in national courts, but in special tribunals stacked in the favor of the corporations. That has been changed in NAFTA 2.0 and is to many people's minds, one of the most important changes, improvements in it. Here in San Miguel, excuse me, in San Miguel, many of us were very involved in opposing that provision in the original NAFTA, and we were happy to see that it is not in this one. Would either of you, maybe Rob in particular, would like to comment a bit, explain about that ISDS and the changes that have been made in it?
Thank you, Cliff. I'll take the opportunity, if that's okay. And perhaps Malin would want to add into this, because I think it intersects with her work as well. I agree that the ISDS provisions have been very costly. There have been dozens of suits by multinational companies against governments in all three of the NAFTA member countries, and this has had a chilling effect, particularly on environmental regulations. Many, and particularly at the state and local level, many states have been hesitant to impose new environmental regulations when they were, or out of fear that they might be sued under the investor-state dispute settlement clauses in the original NAFTA agreement. So I think there was generally agreement that the decision to modify, but not eliminate, I'll come back to what I mean by that in a moment, but to modify the ISDS clause was a significant victory for consumers and for the environment in all three countries. Now, as I understand it, and I'm not a lawyer, I have not looked at these at the terms of the ISDS clauses and changes in detail, but most of the ISDS provisions were eliminated, with the exception of special protections for investors in energy industries in particular. So oil companies got a carve out for investing, especially in Mexico. And of course, oil production is can be highly damaging to the environment. So the threat has not been completely eliminated, but for many kinds of development, the provisions have been eliminated. But I know, for example, there was a case pretty well known where a company wanted to develop a mine in Canada, and they threatened a multi-billion-dollar. And the local government opposed it, and the mining company threatened a massive lawsuit, and so the government opted not to oppose the mine construction, and that mine construction has gone ahead. And it's apparently going to be fairly toxic and destructive to the local environment. So this is an example of the kind of chilling effect that this clause has had on regulation throughout the three countries, and hopefully this ISDS clause is going to lose some of its steam going forward. So that is a major victory.
Malin, did you want to comment?
Yes, well, I just a little bit. I really agree that it's a big victory. For me, I think it's also maybe a risk that, well, it's not that serious, but in these panels that we also have like these negotiations about the benefits and profits lost for the corporations. You can also have some similar effects, not the same effects, because it's not going to be about the millions and millions of dollars that you sue the states for. But I think the pressure seen from my perspective could be very heavy on the representatives of agriculture in Mexico, for example, and that we have to make changes in our laws, even though I think we just have to also wait and see how the changes will hopefully will be much better. I would like to answer this question in the chat here, if I can. How active is the enforcement of the corporate seed ownership? I think that's a question I can develop a little bit upon, because it's very, I think he's meaning here in Mexico. So we have actually just in last period of the Cámara de Diputados, Cámara of Representatives, how is it called in English? Cámara de Diputados, it's called, like the representative house, the parliament, Congress.
The House of Representatives.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you, and very nice to see you. The House of Representatives, they had an initiative to reform the ley de Variedades Vegetales for just a few months ago, and we succeeded to they couldn't discuss it because there was a big resistance against it, because it was actually very extreme. It was more extreme than the convention. It was actually including prisons for the people that exchange and save the seeds. I think that could be modified because there was a discussion about it, but right now it's detained. But I think now we have some elections in the Camera of Representatives, and after that, I think in October or November, we will see another initiative to reform and to enforce the corporate seed ownership in Congress.
Okay. I encourage people to submit your questions by email, because if they go in the chat box, we can easily overlook them. And if you are on YouTube and try to put them in the chat box, we won't see them at all. So please use the email to submit questions. But next we have a question from David Barkin, who is here in the Zoom room. And so you can present your own question or comment.
Yeah, I want to take this opportunity to congratulate you for this event, because this event has been much clearer than previous events of the Global Justice Center in posing a profound civilization crisis. The difference in the analysis between Robert and Malin is incredible, but is not a reflection of what they said so much as what they chose to analyze. And the conflict between economists, sorry about that, Robert. I used to be one of those too.
Congenital disease, I understand.
Yeah, it's a very profound, and it's a terminal disease.
Hmm.
The whole issue of whether we can measure the impacts of the NAFTA or the trade agreements in terms of the impacts on labor. I understand that EPI has been working on this and has done an excellent job on this for decades. And it's very, very important. But the unraveling of culture, the unraveling of society, which is behind the agreement, is really extraordinary. And I think that Malin was very, very good. Her presentation was very clear in showing that NAFTA is not about jobs. NAFTA is not about simply dollars and cents on a trade balance. NAFTA is about destroying the very fabric of Mexican society. And this is, I think, at the heart of what we're talking about when we're talking about the need for La Cuarta Transformación, the fourth transformation. I think that we could talk about the individual issues of Monsanto, we can talk about GMOs, we can talk about each of the points. We can talk about investor trade, we can talk about UPOF, we can talk about intellectual property rights, but in the ultimate analysis, it's a question about culture, it's a question about social structure, and it's a question about the relationship of society to the environment. The United States is going about willy-nilly destroying its environment. And the kind of things, the foods that Malin talked about exporting to the United States, are destroying the US environment in an extraordinary way. A lot of the things she's talking about depend upon the Agua aquifer. The Agua aquifer doesn't have 15 years more of life. And so, and in the process, they will destroy, they're trying to destroy the cultural and environmental basis of Mexico as a country, as an ecosystem, as a biocultural existence. And so I would argue, and I ask this as I turn this into a question, I would argue that what we're talking about is a conflict of cosmologies, a conflict of the vision of what is society, who lives in society, and what is the world's future. The kind of thing that Robert's talking about is completely correct. The United States is exporting its industrial heartland. And I think that that's, you know, the only bad thing about it is that we're importing part of it. Our automobile industry in Mexico is terrible in terms of its impact on workers, in terms of its impact on the environment. The use of water by the automobile industry is extraordinary. But in finishing, I want to raise a very, very important issue: worker rights. There's a lot of talk about how worker rights in Mexico are terrible and they're not enforced and all that. But what about worker rights in the United States? The 11 million migrant workers on whom the United States diet depends are being trampled upon in all sorts of ways. What about the worker rights that we're seeing being trampled upon, not only by migrant workers, documented and undocumented, but also by the structure of industrial production in the United States, which has deteriorated the health and safety of the US workers, and there's no discussion about the need for a Mexican labor attaché to begin to question what is the nature of worker rights in US factories. Let me quit there, so not abuse. I wasn't invited to this talk.
I should point out that next week we will be hearing more extensively from David. We are having a First Peoples Day webinar next Monday, and he and along with Gustavo Esteva are the two main speakers who will tell us more about the civilizational challenge that Mexico is facing. But do either of our speakers want to respond to any of the points that were just raised?
Malin, do you want to start? I'm happy to talk.
Yeah, you can go. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, David. I appreciate your comments, and I'm a recovering economist, like yourself. I should note that I started my career working for Barry Commoner, who was a fairly well-known environmentalist back in the 1960s and 1970s. So I
was a colleague of his at Washington University.
Well, that's where it was. I went to school there. Okay, small world. You know, I helped Barry on 2 of his books about energy policy. So I was there in the late 1970s. And you know, I think you're right. You know, there are broader issues here. Clearly, you know, labor rights are critical, and enforcement of labor rights ought to start at home. EPI, where I work, has long been a proponent of both greater labor rights enforcement. We're a big supporter of the House PRO Act, which contains a number of provisions to make it easier to organize labor unions here in the U.S., card check and so on. We've also been a longtime proponent of much more effective reform of U.S. immigration policy. And we've had a whole area of our work on this on the website. Labor lawyer Daniel Costa is leading that work, but one of EPI's founders has been for many years promoting broad-based reform of labor law, which would emphasize the legalization of undocumented workers in the United States, which we think is key to the enforcement of their labor rights in this country. It will allow them to join unions and to petition for enforcement of minimum wages and state worker standards and so on, things they're now afraid to do because out of fear of being being deported from this country. So I think you know, we're in an important transitional moment here. We haven't talked about the election very much. Came up in the chat box, but it's critical. If this country it moves in a more progressive direction, if Joe Biden is elected, then there'll be opportunities to address some of these issues. Whether Biden's going to do that or not, I don't know. I'll just drift briefly on the one question that came up in the box about Biden and what we can demand of him. I am concerned that Biden is going to go back to the Clinton and Obama trade agenda. He's talked about resurrecting the TPP agreement and other free trade agreements. My own personal position, and this is one that Jeff Foe has advocated, is that we really need to get our own domestic house in order. And we should put a freeze on negotiating trade and investment deals going forward. EPI, the institute I work for, has a broad-based policy agenda up on our website, which is epi.org. I'll put that in the chat box and a link to the agenda. In the trade area, it's a multi-part agenda. We emphasize there that we ought to be on the trade front. We ought to be pursuing advancement of a broad global labor rights agenda, and that ought to start at home with the U.S. adoption of the ILO core labor standards, which we have not done, including the right to organize and collectively bargain. We don't recognize those core ILO standards. So that would be critical. We also suggest pursuing things like tax enforcement on a global scale to end global tax avoidance by multinational corporations. But I don't think pursuit of more trade and investment deals ought to be on the agenda anytime soon. I can talk about what else is on the agenda in the trade area if time permits. I'll stop there. Malin, you have more to add?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much, David, for your comment. I think it was lovely because you really showed that sort of my main message was put out there, because that's one of the things that you can see here is for me, one of the biggest challenges for the fourth Cuarta Transformación López Obrador government, that they have these contradictions between where it's sort of you can see it in the agriculture. You can see it in agriculture secretary, where you have some promoters for like the agri-industrial monoculture production model, and actually the head of the secretary, for instance, and you have the other ones, some other ones that are sort of want to really support small-scale farmers with price guarantees. That's also like as something that's very anti-systemical in this way, in this context of the free trade agreements. I think that's also why it's so sad that we had to sign and implement Nafta 2.0, because it's a very big threat, because it's all of this right, but it's a very big threat, and I understand that we had to sign it and had to implement it because we're so dependent on the United States economy. But it puts us in a situation that we have to find and really look for the balance between these two models of agro-industrial production monoculture model that's destroying our, like you said, the bioculture existence, because it's really something that we can see in the consumption in Mexico. In the context of NAFTA, the consumption patterns have changed a lot in the context of the neoliberal model, that we have this on one hand, we have this like fast food industry, like with the soda, with all this overconsumption of highly processed food. And like we are one of the countries in the world that produces most highly processed food. And on the other hand, we have this lovely, vast biodiversity that still exists there, and it's still profoundly connected to our food culture. Like we have mazes that they have to exist to be able to eat what we eat in our national days and our festivities, and it's present every day. But it's very hard to find this balance, right? Because on the one hand, there are some people that want to protect in the government, that want to protect the native maize production, and on the other hand, we have the threat that's coming with the reform of the Ley de Variedades Vegetales, for example, that's privatizing the seeds. So it's very hard to look for this combination. I think that from our perspective, one of the things that we can do is create laws that is protecting our biodiversity. But it's also, it's a very big challenge, because we don't have many examples in the world to follow, because it's not many countries. Maybe you can, if you know some, in countries in the world that have succeeded to protect the biodiversity and like combine it with the agro-industrial production model. I think it's maybe it's not possible. And so it's a very big conflict, and it's one of the contradictions. Like for me, one of the main so a lot of contradictions and a lot of challenges. But from my perspective, this is one of the most important one in this, or for us, still new government, because there's a lot of pressure from outside with these free trade agreements, for example. Thank you.
Let me put up again the address or the email address you should send your questions to: global.justice.cliff@gmail.com. And following up on what has just been said, we have a very interesting example right here in San Miguel municipality of the impact of corporate agriculture on campesinos. There is an area, maybe 30 minutes from the city, around Los Rodrigos, where land that used to be cultivated by campesinos, small scale agriculture, has all been privatized and is now in the hands of a huge landowner, Javier Usabiaga, who happened to have been Vicente Fox's Minister of Agriculture in his early years of his administration. Usabiaga now owns, I think it's something like 7 square miles of prime farmland, flat, rich soil, deep wells to irrigate with. And on land that used to be producing food for the Mexican people, now what is growing is broccoli and garlic and other off-season crops that are being exported to the United States, and it's contributing to the depletion of the aquifer here. Something like 90+% of the water drawn from the ground, from the aquifer, is for agriculture. So that basically, when we see truckloads of asparagus, broccoli, or the like passing through San Miguel on the way to the US, we know that really we are exporting our water. A dry area like this, it's crazy to be exporting water to the United States. But North American consumers want their off-season vegetables. But what has happened to the campesinos who used to live on that land? There used to be many villages there with their own land. Well, the land was privatized. They sold it to Usabiaga, and now they are working in the fields, but not for themselves any longer. They're working for a large landowner. Do we have other questions? Yes, here's a question about seed protectors. Is there coordination of efforts with seed protectors around the globe? Can these groups make a difference? I agree that culture is being torn apart. This comment comes from Andrea Kaufman.
Well, yes, there are a lot of networks around the globe. We have every now and then Shiva Vandana Shiva is coming here to Mexico, and they have it's a very interesting in India. In some ways a similar situation, right? They have a vast bioculture, like the culture and the agrobiodiversity is very, very big there, and it's very important. And also they have the pressure from the GMOs, so it's a similar situation. And yeah, I think we could say that we have some coordination between us, but I think the most important part for also for Mexico is is making the alliances here in Mexico. And here we have the La Campaña Sin Maíz No País, and we have this. Actually, there have been intents to reform and to privatize the seeds since 2012. And even during 2012, we succeeded to stop it. So, and this is because of the good coordination between the different groups, and that it's so important, the seeds in Mexico, right? Because it's also like the class action against the GMO corporations. It's amazing that we've been through during 7 years in a place from a very opposition, in a place of opposition against all logic, economical logic that was created like 7 years ago. They had this rational system and the economy more or less worked from some perspectives, and we succeeded to resist the implementation of GMOs, and that's very amazing. And it's all thanks to the organization. And I think actually I think Mexico is a very good example of this, because the campesinos historically have always resisted against well, we can just start with the Mexican Revolution and then we can go from there, right? Because what you're talking about, Cliff, it's something that we saw before the Mexican Revolution and afterwards as well, but it's sort of going backwards. It's sort of like, that's also why it was called in 1992 the contra-reform of the Constitution, when we again allowed privatization of land, of the ejido land, which is a collective property, collective property really. And like in a lot of places in Mexico, this transformation to private property has been very slow. Well, bureaucracy and like internal conflicts and stuff, but also for the resistance, and because it's very important this diversity of cultivation. You can see it also like with the maize. There are some campesinos that have some native maize growing for their own consumption, and then they might have some hybrids for selling, because it's really like different types of different prioritizations, right? So I think we could actually, go back to the question, I came quite far from the question, but I think we should make the global alliances much stronger, of course, and it's very important because we can this exchange between experiences in different countries, because the UPOV 91 has been implemented in a lot of countries around the world, a lot of rich countries that have very different positions and very different conditions. But you can also like look, okay, so maybe hopefully not, but maybe we have to ratify UPOV 91, and then we can learn from other experience. How can we still protect biodiversity? Some says we can't. Some people say we can't, it's impossible, but maybe we have to implement it, and then we have to look for a way to protect it, and then we can look at other countries, how have they did, what did they do, was it successful and stuff. So it's very important with the organization across the borders.
Here is here's another comment. I will screen share with you from David Barkin. His acquisitions, referring to Usabayaga, I believe, are illegal. He's also responsible for contamination by arsenic in the aquifer, something that David mentioned to the center quite a number of years ago. Now, David Barkin was one of the speakers at our first founding conference back in 2004. And certainly the contamination of the aquifer here by arsenic as well as fluoride is something that we're very much aware of. And it is something that there are many NGOs that are trying to deal with. But it's particularly serious because though a small portion of the water extracted from the aquifer goes for domestic use, much of that is for use by campesinos in the small villages around this area. Okay, I don't see any other questions, and I think
Can I make a comment?
Certainly, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that the Usabayaga, who was, as you mentioned, was Secretary of Agriculture, is a particularly good example of the real problem of the corruption that pervades the management of Mexican agriculture. But it's directly affecting you. You said, well, we don't use much of the water. Much of the water in urban San Miguel, because most of us actually have to buy bottled water. and the extraordinary cost of that and the control of that by transnational corporations. I'm referring to Danone, I'm referring to Coca-Cola, and I'm referring to, well, there are 3 or 4 large corporations that control bottled water. Mexico is the second largest consumer per capita of bottled water in the world. And the situation in San Miguel is extraordinary because it was predictable, absolutely predictable. And at that session where I warned you, I don't remember, do you know what year it was, Cliff?
2004.
Yesterday. You were listening to people from the UNAM. You were listening to people from the UNAM already describing the underlying geological problems that were involved in that. But more importantly, the social segregation of health as a result of that. You're talking about the campesinos who are using it. The implications of that are quite extraordinary in terms of the way in which the health deterioration affects different kinds of social groups in different ways. And that's the part of the underlying message that I think Malin is trying to convey. Fortunately, it's too late for San Miguel, but the leadership of the National Water Commission has been changed now, just last week. And, you know, it's very nice to see all of our friends who've gotten promoted to try to unseat and change that dynamic. But San Miguel, the international conflict in Chihuahua, the mining companies, you're right around the corner from Zacatecas, where there isn't a single person in Zacatecas who isn't being poisoned by water, even if it's bottled. It's really quite extraordinary. But, you know, when I think about it, when I compare it, you've got in the United States, Flint, Michigan, and Flint was only the tip of the iceberg, right, Robert? How many all over the Midwest are giving poor people poisoned water, literally poisoned water? And this has to do then with what I was trying to raise. And I would like to insist, Cliff, maybe you're tired of it, that what we're talking about is an extraordinary displacement of social values, of environmental values by the bottom line, the dollars, and privatizing these resources, privatizing the public services that are going on around this is something that we're all having to confront. And to some extent, what we hope that we're doing here in Mexico as part of the new opening and a change of the political environment, look at that wonderful smile on Malin's face, is we're not going to make all the changes that are necessary, but what we're doing is making it evident that there's a need for changing the culture of public administration and the relationship of people to the environment. I mean, Malin was talking about GMOs, corn. I mean, the rice and the wheat thing is just incredible. If you think about it, the wheat green revolution was invented here, and it was invented in a way that destroyed aquifers all over the world. But here today, we have the problem of bees, of honey. Mexico is no longer so, oh, I'm sorry, let me change that. Mexican indigenous people, the Mayan people in Yucatan, who have produced some of the world's best honey, organic honey, are now facing problems because of threats of GMO contamination. The pervasiveness of this notion that progress is written in a laboratory, is made in a laboratory, and more product is better than less product is so much a part of what this debate about the free trade agreement is about.
Yeah, it seems to me that it's important to realize the importance of overriding importance of the privatization agenda that that NAFTA represented. AMLO is attacking neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is the principles that undergirded the NAFTA agreement that allowed for the privatization of the Ejido land. Ejido land, the collective control of land by communities, was what undergirded the material basis, as it were, for the social and cultural life of Mexico ever since such was restored back in after the Mexican Revolution. But really, what the Ejido represented was a rescue of the commons. Before Europeans came to this hemisphere, the land was all in common. There was no private ownership of land. Communities collectively controlled their land. And what the Europeans brought was the idea of private property. And it was that it was the effort to reestablish the commons in a limited way with the Ejidos coming out of the 1917 Constitution that was intended to provide or restore the material base for campesino life. But the United States, as part of the negotiations for NAFTA, insisted that that provision in the Constitution, Article 27, be changed to allow for the privatization of Ejido land. And that's what has made it possible for large landowners like Usabiaga and foreign corporations as well to privatize much of the agricultural land and convert it not any longer to producing for the Mexican people, but rather growing for export markets. Well, I'm sorry to go on about this. That's one of my favorite topics. And I thank you, David, for your contribution to that discussion. Are there any closing comments that either of our speakers would like to make? We're running out of time.
I can just add to what you said now, because I think it's similar to what's happening now with Nafta 2.0 and the seeds, because that's actually what they're doing. They are demanding us to privatize our seeds, to open up the seeds for the corporations and to appropriate for the corporations to appropriate the seeds in the same way that they wanted to do it with the land. So it's like we are still in this struggle to resist this. I think, yeah, you have one example of this, the privatization of land, but there's still a lot of resistance against privatization of land, privatization of land, even though it was 26 years ago, NAFTA went, when NAFTA started. But I think that's also one of the things. Yeah, now it's the seeds they're going after. So it's a very important moment in this. Like, we have this very, very complicated situations. We have almost everything is privatized, but we still have some things, and we really, really need to fight to maintain these commons, which are the seeds. It should be a common, and it's a common. We have the water, we have the struggle of the water, and I hope it's going to be better now when it did change that David mentioned. But I think it's like we have to have these small oases still that we have to keep, and we have to keep them, make them grow. We have, for another example of an intent of protecting this, is the law of foment and protecting native maize that was approved this year. We'll see how it turns out, because like with the laws, sometimes they just be a paper and it's not really implemented. But hopefully it would like open up a space where we actually have politics that are supporting the native maize production, because we haven't seen those politics yet. We have seen the price guarantees, for example, for maize, but they didn't even buy the colored maize. They said they have to be white maize. It's like almost like, oh, we raised this even with the maize, right? But there have been a lot of critiques against it. So I hope like next year, this program will be better. And of course, I think that the colored maize, they should pay more for them, right? Because this the value in them, that they're never going to pay the whole value of the maize. But you, like David said, you can't really put it in economics, the value of this maize. But it's very important that we try to look for solutions in the small agency space that we have. But this, our government right now has given us some more agency than the last government, at least. That's true. Yeah, I know you don't have the same situation in the United States. It's a little bit more sad for the moment. Maybe you want to develop, Robert.
Well, we have an election coming up in less than 40 days, so we'll see how all that turns out. I want to close to bring it back full circle to the NAFTA 2 agreement, USMCA, and point out that I think it's important to recognize that the most significant changes in that agreement concerned tightening up intellectual property standards. About expanding the agreement to cover digital trade and expand the protection for intellectual property rights. So on a scale, you get a little bit of protection for labor rights in Mexico. It remains to be seen whether the changes in Mexican labor law are actually enforced. We know that Mexico continues to assassinate and to arrest labor organizers. That has continued even after the new labor laws were implemented. We got a few cosmetic changes in auto trade standards that will also extend later in 10 years, maybe, to glass and steel. I haven't talked about that, but that's also in there. Frankly, as the EPI's current president and I said, when the new agreement was released, this deal is what we call weak tea at best. And so I don't think it's going to do much for workers in the US, but it is concretely going to benefit holders of capital and intellectual property. And Donald Trump hasn't changed the structure of the deal in that way at all. It is an agreement protecting the rights of investors and not that of workers or the environment. So we have a lot of work to do to try and develop agreements that do shift the balance of power back to favor workers, farmers, campesinos, and I think this conversation today has illustrated that. So thank you, Cliff, for organizing. I appreciate the opportunity to be here with all of you.
Well, and thank you, both of our speakers, Robert Scott and Malin Jönsson, for very informative presentations and a very stimulating discussion that grew out of it. I hope that our listeners enjoyed today's program. You should know that all of our revenue-raising programs have been canceled due to the coronavirus. Nevertheless, we continue to pay our Mexican staff. So if you can make a tax-deductible donation, please do so at our website, globaljusticecenter.org. I want to give thanks to our Global Justice team that makes these webinars possible. Olivia Canales, Liz Mestres, Gregory Diamant, Roberto Robles, Colette Mora, Betsy Bowman. Today's webinar, as well as past programs, are available on YouTube and accessible on our website. I want to call your attention to a couple upcoming programs. One, this Wednesday, we have some Spanish language webinars that we're doing. This Wednesday, we have one on the environmental agenda, mining and water, very related to what we were just discussing. And then next Monday, we will have the webinar on First Peoples Day. We no longer observe Columbus Day. We want to honor the people who lived here for centuries or even thousands of years before Columbus ever set sight on this continent. So we have David Barkin, who you've heard from today, and Gustavo Esteva, well-known Mexican deprofessionalized intellectual, as he calls himself. They will be our speakers next Monday, and I hope you will join us again for that 1 o'clock Mexico time on Monday, the 12th of October. Thank you again for joining us today, and I'm Cliff Durand, now signing off.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah.